with a bit of a deep question. How long do you think you're going to live? Keep this number in the back of your head. I, like most people, think I'm going to live to 100 years old, but that actual number lands somewhere around, but there's only a 2% chance I actually make it there. The actual number of how long most people tend to live is around here, at about 74 to 76 years old. And this leads me into my next and arguably more important question. What do you think the midpoint of your life is? Now, this can seem kind of counterintuitive because, as we previously described, it should be around 38 to 40. But if we take into account the time perception as you age and gets faster, then this number tends to get a lot lower. What it actually happens to be is around 20 years old. And whenever I first heard this, that the middle of my life was at 20, I was shocked. And I'm sure most of you are too. And this leads me into my next most important question, which is, how can I use that time to make the most impact? Over the course of the next 15 minutes, I'll break down the unsung secret to chasing happiness, how to accomplish a month's worth of work in several hours, and how you can use these techniques from the minute you wake up in the morning to the second you go to sleep at night, and maybe along the way, break down some conventional wisdom using science. So, my name is Hoinkes, and this is Chasing Happiness and Time Through Deep Work, a neuroscience-informed talk on flow psychology. So, getting started, our job is to maximize the amount of output or learning or whatever work we can do over time. And so to do this, there are two ways we can approach this. One is just biting the bullet and getting started. And whenever we account for like the jumps and the troughs of like the time it takes to learn different things, we can plot this trend to be about linear. And regrettably, this intuition kind of sucks at modeling reality. We previously said that we don't have as much time to live, so we don't want to spend our time, or the amount of work we do, as a function relative to time. We don't want to put in the most amount of time in order to get the most amount of effort. And so I propose a second solution. Instead of starting with doing the work, we instead learn how to do work efficiently so that whatever work we do, or whatever we try to learn, only takes place during these high intensity intervals. We increase the slope of our thing, and therefore we can get more work done over time. And so the natural next question is, how do we go about doing that? And here, I'd like to get a little more specific, because there's lots of pseudosciences here that we can kind of get tripped up on. Things that you've probably seen on social media are things like using a Pomodoro method, taking breaks, or my favorite parental favorite is turning off that damn phone. But they all try to get at something underlying, and that something is deep work. And so, to be more scientifically specific, deep work, or the term coined by its founder, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, is a concept that involves total and complete engagement in a task. More specifically, whenever people were doing studies over this, they found a 500% increase in productivity, and it is considered by many to be the holy grail of performance. So this is kind of the thing we're looking for. But let me be more specific about what exactly I'm talking about through some illustrated examples. Has anyone been doing homework 15 minutes before it's due, being deeply engaged in sports, playing video games very intensely, or skiing, snowboarding, or any other seasonal activity? Try to connect your thoughts while or your experiences from this with the next following criteria as defined by its founder, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. So, in order to start deep work, you need clear goals to know exactly what you need to do. You need immediate, unambiguous feedback, and this can look like either yes or no answers as responses, or sensory feedback. You need a balance between the challenge of a task and your ability to accomplish it. You need merging of action and awareness. Think about a surgeon who already knows, who is aware of everything that's happening in the operating room and can immediately act, and their hands move sort of from muscle memory. They don't know exactly what's going on, but it feels like kind of a flow. Total and complete focus on your task. A sense of self-control and a strong element of self-efficacy. A lack of self-consciousness. You don't have that inner voice in your head telling you can't do something. You have a sense of time distortion, meaning that something that would have would have perceived as taking like several hours to complete takes only a couple minutes. And finally, an autotelic or intrinsically rewarding experience. And this is constituted from a lot of dopamine connections and dopamine responses secreted in the brain. Okay, now I'm sure a lot of that kind of sounds skeptical because a lot of it is a subjective experience. So I'm sure you're probably thinking, what puts this ahead of any of the other previous techniques that I've described before? And it's actually a very interesting question because researchers thought about this and they used a series of metrics. They used those previous those nine criteria to subjectively rate researchers or people's experiences in flow. And what they found was neurological consistencies that allows us to have some scientific grounding. And so let's go through that right now. Let's describe the neuroscience behind why things work, and hopefully that'll gain an intuition on how we can access it for ourselves. So the best model I like to use in order to describe this is the explicit and implicit framework in our brains. So our explicit system, we can kind of think of the you that you interpret. It's the conscious inner voice that is in charge of verbal processing and higher level attentional feedback. And basically how I like to think of this is it's what separates you, a human, from like a dog who's focused on something and then sees a squirrel chasing by and then immediately like goes and changes its attention. And so while this like inner voice or the thing that's talking is good for things that are like more explicit or absolute logic, it isn't necessarily the best at doing internal processing, kind of what we want to do from flow. And so this is where the implicit system comes into play. The implicit system is a lot more nebulous. It's very hard to define because whenever we're thinking about something or we're perceiving reality, we don't have access to our implicit system. You can think of it like the autopilot that happens as you're doing a deeply engaging task. It's something where you know all the actions for what to do, and it draws a lot on your passive memory instead of your working memory. And let's break down exactly what I mean by the explicit and implicit frameworks. I'm sure the implicit system is a little bit harder to characterize, so one of the good examples that I like to use and why the implicit and explicit frameworks can't work together is this scene from The Matrix, Stop Trying to Hit Me and Hit Me, where we see the divide between somebody's explicit network and their implicit network. You can't think about doing a task while actually doing the task. So, our job is, according to what we previously described from the 9 criteria used for deep work, what we want to do is we want to silence our explicit system as much as possible and power up or drive the implicit system as much as possible. So what exactly is going on in the brain as we do that? The explicit system uses the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which looks a little something like this. Its job is higher level attention, temporal integration, which basically means like your perception of time, and yeah, that's basically it. And then also your temporal lobes, specifically your frontal and medial temporal lobes. These are mostly used for speech and things like that. And so we can kind of see these explicit framework come into play because that's our inner voice that's talking to us. On the other hand, we have our implicit system, which is driven primarily by the basal ganglia, which is this thing in the center of our brain. And what it's made up of is, if you've ever heard the phrase gray matter, it's made up of a lot of gray matter with a bunch of neuron connections with dopamine intersections. So like we said before, since it's an intrinsically motivated experience, we can see those dopamine is very important for these connections to fire in the brain. And this is kind of what we want to target. So the implicit system, it sends its signals or whatever intrinsic processing it does to the premotor, which is our explicit system, as well as, the prefrontal, which is our explicit system, and then the premotor system, which controls our muscle systems. And this is what allows us to immediately have that connection from our brain into our muscles. Okay. And I want to bring this up because this is very interesting to kind of understand the differences in processing. They did this procedure called a split brain procedure, where they took the corpus callosum, which is the connection between your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere of the brain, and they split it in half, basically severed the connection. And using a bunch of different tests, what they found is that there's an actual thing called the left brain interpreter, which invents explanations for what your intrinsic system thinks of. And literally, they had a patient, and they asked him to explain what he was seeing, and he literally made up a random explanation on the spot that had no way or sense and shape in reality, and he was fully convinced that was like truth. And so what we see here is that our explicit system really isn't good at modeling reality, and our implicit system is the one that really focuses our intuition. Okay, that was a lot of scary science stuff, and we're almost out of the hills here, but let's go through two more things that are slightly interesting that will help us access flow. The first of which is allostatic load. Now, typically whenever we think of stress on the brain, we think of it as something like a linear correlation. So the less stress I have, the more possibility or performance I have in order to work, and the higher stress I have, the less able to work I am. But really this isn't the case. Most people are familiar with whenever I have a high stress level, where I have like an overloading or a breakdown of my processing. And what's interesting is there's also a low underload of processing, where like you can kind of picture this as like, I haven't done anything yet for the day, and I'm still like scrolling on reels or doing something like stupid, and I still can't reach that optimal performance level. So what actually has to happen is, in order for like maximal performance to be achieved through allostatic load, you need to balance the stress level to its optimum, and it sort of stress here acts sort of like motivation, but only to an extent. And we can increase the level of balance we have here through healthy activities and things like that, which I will and self-efficacy, which I will describe later. And finally, brainwaves. You don't need to know very much about them. They're taken from like a brain scanner, EEG, and this lower down here we have basically how asleep you are, and the higher up is how awake you are. And flow state, which is kind of the thing we're trying to accomplish, happens between alpha waves and theta waves. And I want you to keep this in the back of your head, because we'll come back to use it later whenever we're trying to access flow. Speaking of accessing flow, let's get into that. So the flow cycle is consistent of 4 different steps: struggle, to release, to flow, and finally recovery. And throughout this, I'm going to use an illustrative example of a procrastinator's favorite use for flow, which is starting homework 15 minutes before it's due. And I'm sure we can all relate to this. So let's start on the first part of the flow cycle, which is struggle. Struggle is characterized by one term coined as friction, and we'll talk about exactly what that friction looks like. But if you want to visualize it using our example, it looks like this. This is my roommate right here, scrolling on reels from 4 o'clock p.m. to 11:50 p.m. in our dog bed. Okay, but let's be a little more scientific here and talk about exactly what I mean. Okay, this is a common minimization problem you've probably seen in science. In biology and chemistry, you've probably seen it as like an activation function graph for like a catalyst reaction. Computer science is like a gradient descent problem, whatever. If you're familiar with the graph, great. We're going to flip it upside down, and now it's a maximization problem. Is everybody following me? Okay. Now we're going to set our y-axis to dopamine level. And this kind of makes sense intuitively, because our brain wants to naturally follow things that make us happy, that reward chemical, if you want to call it that. And so we'll set our maximum dopamine level to the state we achieve in flow. As I said, it's a very intrinsically rewarding or auto-selling experience, so that flow state kind of maximizes that function. On the other side, however, we have a distraction, which is a local dopamine maximum, which basically means that like it's not the most dopamine we can receive, but it's good enough, so if we go in either direction, we're going to lose some dopamine from going there. And here we can find our culprit for friction, for struggle in the flow state, which is friction. And so if I'm distracted on like Instagram Reels or doing something else, I literally have to deprive my brain of dopamine in order to pass this friction before finding flow. And this kind of sucks, because you have to deprive your brain of dopamine, and that's counterintuitive to what our brain naturally wants to do. So, how do we fix it? There are 2 ways we can go about fixing this, which is, 1, if you're aware of how the brain works, you can bite the bullet. You can just say, okay, I'm going to stop whatever distraction I'm doing, and climb down this, and take about 15 minutes, it's about 15 or 20 minutes before the onset, before you can pass this friction mark, and then I can go into deep work. And this kind of sucks because it's a little inconsistent, and it relies on that external trigger. I basically have to tell myself, or force myself, to pass that friction gap. On the other hand, you can do something a little more intrinsic by decreasing the level of dopamine you have for your distractions. And I know social media has probably bastardized this term of dopamine detox, but here it has some scientific merit. By decreasing the level of dopamine and our distraction level, it makes it easier to step over that friction in order to find flow more consistently. But let's talk a little bit more about what that onset of flow looks like. More specifically, the second stage, release. Release in our previous procrastinator example is whenever he gets an alarm or some kind of Canvas notification to start doing work, and so he heads to his desk. That's an example of an external flow trigger. But an intrinsic flow trigger is what I think is a lot more interesting and a lot more applicable to your lives. And so I'll kind of discuss how that works. So let's use what I previously described as the brainwaves. Remember how I said that the onset conditions necessary for flow were between alpha and theta waves, specifically 8 hertz or less. What we need to do is, if we can simulate the onset conditions, if we can simulate getting our brain between alpha and theta, as well as like balancing our allostatic load, we can simulate going into flow and then actually just make it there. And how do we do this? This leads me to my number one most applicable or useful trick for this entire TED Talk. So if you're scared of like any of the science stuff, it's really simple. Basically, because of REM sleep, which is the sleep that you experience after dreaming or during dreams, right before you wake up, it's very similar to theta waves. And as we wake up more, that theta wave becomes slowly closer to alpha waves. What this means is we have that balance between alpha and theta, and since we just woke up, our allostatic load is already balanced. And so what we find is if we start work within 60 to 120 seconds of waking up, we'll immediately go into our deep work state consistently. And anecdotally, it probably seems like this is like a lot of pseudoscience going into this, but anecdotally, if you try it, you can get a lot of work done. Whenever I wrote the script or did the research for this entire talk, I used this technique in order to maximize my efficiency doing it, and I managed to get out what would normally take me weeks worth of work done in like 2 or 3 days, which is maybe like 3 hours. So it definitely works. Okay, now that we have the ability to access or consistently access and go into flow, we should try our best to maximize the amount of time we're in it so we don't have to go through the struggle stage or the recovery stage again. And let's revisit the definition in order to figure out how we can do that efficiently. As I said previously, these first 3 are the most important ways, or I didn't say this previously, but using this previous criteria, these first 3 are the most important in order to access or stay constant within flow. We have clear goals. So in our homework example, this would be, I know exactly what homework task I need to do. Immediate unambiguous feedback, this is sort of variable for our homework example, if it's online, sure. But the most important requirement for prolonging the time and flow is the skill challenge balance. And I want to talk a little bit more deeply about that. Okay, so here we have an example of a skill challenge paradigm. Over here, if whatever task I'm doing is a lot more challenging than my skill level is able to handle, then I get anxious and I really don't want to do whatever work I have in front of me. Consequently, if my skill is a lot higher than the challenge at hand, I get bored and I don't want to start. This is kind of the procrastinator's example, and where we find our homework example for previous. Since it's homework, I know how to do the task, but I really just don't want to do it if it's like I have a month worth of time in order to do a project. I'd much rather have something more challenging to my skill level and something over here, giving myself 1 hour or 15 minutes in order to do an assignment. And so this actually allows me to get into flow more consistently and kind of helps understand the intuition behind procrastination in general. We want to maximize the amount of dopamine or the experience of whatever task we're doing, and so we intentionally try to make that task as challenging as possible in order for it to match our skill level. Okay. The last, but definitely most important aspect of the flow cycle is recovery. A lot of the times, especially in Asian countries and America, we have this idea that we should be doing work. And especially because of social media, this like flashy hustle culture is like very driven from this, but this really is inconsistent with how we should view flow. Flow is something that should be like a black or white experience, like an on or an off. There shouldn't be like a gray area in between. And we can see this from our recovery stage, which the goal of the recovery stage is to remanage that allostatic load so that we can go back into it for another experience. What this looks like is sleep. It also looks like exercise, recharging your brain through music, or hanging out with friends, things like that. Things that are active levels of recovery. And this is necessary in order to revisit the flow cycle and start back over again. Okay. Before we conclude, I would have one more example for a generalization that we can make for the things, the neuroscience we learned and the intuitions we gained during this talk. Okay. So, starting from this number 6, self-efficacy is one of the most important concepts we can have more generally, and I'll explain exactly why in a second. Is everybody familiar with the concept of the placebo effect? Self-efficacy is a lot similar to the placebo effect in that it has real neurological benefits from something that doesn't seem like it should work, or the belief in something working. And I'll explain to you why in just a second. Self-efficacy is believing you have the ability to do something, and so we'll start our cycle or our positive feedback loop by just truthfully or not truthfully believing that we can do a task. From our self-efficacy, as we've seen, since it's one of the 9 criteria for flow, this leads us into our active flow state. And what does flow state do from our neuroscience? Well, it silences the part of the brain, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that gives us that self-doubt, or that's our inner voice that tells us we can't do things. And what that leads to is a higher self-confidence. And a higher self-confidence just inherently leads to higher self-efficacy. If I'm more confident about something, then I have more ability for change. I feel like I can do more. And this becomes a self-fulfilling cycle that you can use generally anywhere. So what this looks like more applicably is if you're in a social situation and you have that loud inner voice telling you can't interact with people or doing things like that, suppressing that inner voice here, or just believing in yourself to have a higher self-efficacy, starts that positive feedback loop that pays dividends like tenfold. And so it becomes something we definitely want to utilize. Okay. So, finally, I want to branch off of something that Michelle brought up that I also 100% agree with. And this is this concept that work and happiness are diametrically opposed. This is something that I find very interesting because our natural intuition is to think that doing work is bad. Doing work makes me not happy. Doing work is something I just physically don't want to do. And if we approach a task in the right way, if we have that skills challenge balance, if we have all those previous things, or if we format it in a way that is very flow inducive, then we actually find some of the most rewarding and engaging tasks through our work. Work specifically, when accessed through flow, is 3 times more deep. It's 3 times more effective at getting us into this state, and we end up being a lot more happier from it. And so, just this intuition that work and happiness don't work together, I think is just patently false. That was it for my TED Talk. If you are interested in my citations, you can meet me after. But thank you so much for the TEDxT for hosting this, as well as our ballot board. Thank you.